This is Chris Madden from Woodhall Press, and this is an episode of Publish This. Today I'm talking to Baron Wurmser, who is the author of 18 books, including Songs from a Voice, being the recollections, stanzas, and observations of Abe Runyon, songwriter and performer. Baron is an educator and a poet. He was the Poet Laureate of Maine from 2000 to 2005. He has won an NEA grant, a Guggenheim Fellowship. He is the founder of Frost Place, the Poetry Center, and he has written many novels, a couple of novels, including Teach Us That Peace, and a number of poetry collections. He is the author of the memoir, The Road Washes Out in Spring, and his essays have been collected in Best American Essays in 2014 and 2018. This, again, is his 18th book, Songs from a Voice. This is sort of my beaten up copy of it. And we'll be talking about the outspoken protagonist, Abe Runyon, Bob Dylan's influence on him, and the circumstances of an imagination and how things come into being. So welcome, Baron. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Chris.
So Songs is a journey through American history of the 50s, the Delta Blues, sort of childhood in the shadow of the atom bomb. A book I would say is anything but the usual poetic breeze. Like your last novel, Tom of Vietnam, it's chapterless, has an unusual narrative voice, and it features quatrains as chapter breaks, which are, I believe, very much inspired by Emily Dickinson. Why this way of telling a story? How is this a good way of getting at the character of Abe Runyon and conveying his voice?
Well, as many people in my generation and not in my generation, I've been hugely influenced by Bob Dylan, his songs, and particularly the words of the songs. So there are many, many lovely melodies, obviously. And so I've carried that around for decades. And somehow, and I can't be more explicit really, this notion came to me that I could create a narrator who was analogous. So what I was interested in, I mean, there are a million books about Dylan, but what I was interested in was the notion of imagination apprehending imagination. It's the terrain, the circumstances of his imagination that really interested me. And I've always had a hold on me, and I'm sure they've had a hold on many people, the notion that, this kid from East Nowhere, so to speak, turns up and kind of changes the world. How did that happen? Well, of course, we don't know how that happened, but I could guess. Mm-hmm. And the book is a guess. As the reviewer in Britain, I think she called it a beautiful speculation, and it is a speculation. Mm-hmm. Obviously, I don't, as you and I know, I don't pretend that this is any kind of gospel truth about the actual person, born Robert Zimmerman. But to me, it gets to places that all these books that focus on the externals, who he listened to and whose records he stole and what books he read, don't quite get it. So that was the impulse. And then the further impulse that you brought up was about the quatrains. And I mean, let's face it, I'm not going to write Bob Dylan songs. But I wanted to indicate something about this person's, to my mind, lyric genius. So I started kind of scratching around in the barnyard for American lyric geniuses who used rhyme, and up popped Emily Dickinson. And, a good Dickinson quatrain is a whole poem. And so I thought, oh, well, and I love, I love her work. So I thought, well, let's fool around with this because I could use rhyme, I could use meter, and I can try to write a whole poem that'll echo the previous chapter in some way, shape, or form and give some sense of this person's predilection for rhyme and meter, which obviously is crucial to who my character is, to who Bob Dylan is. So that just sort of happened, just kind of fell from the sky, so to speak.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting, just the way that it's a commentary on the prior chapter. On page 51, Abe is a schoolboy, and they've been doing these, duck and cover drills, which they must have realized were not going to be of much help. But if I can, there's a section. I'd lie in my bed and wait. It wasn't as though it had to happen during school hours on a weekday. None of our teachers talked about that. They acted as though the Russians would call us up and tell us the bombs were coming after spelling and before geography. That seemed almost funny. Meanwhile, I stared at the ceiling and waited. As for my Uncle Simon, one of my mom's three brothers used to say, "Don't kid yourself, kid." And then that's followed by the quatrain that says, "I felt the heat, a blast on my face. My body began to fade. Everything fell, the sky fell too, all the making unmade." And that in particular, it's dense, but it puts a stamp on the chapter. And I think reading it and even rereading it, I pause to reflect, sometimes from the prose, but sometimes from the quatrains. So when you were building the chapters, I'm curious, did you start from the quatrains? Again, I'm using the term chapters loosely, or were they suggested from what was happening in the prose sections?
Yeah, they were suggested by what was happening in the prose. I started with the prose, and I wrote a couple of chapters, and I was not happy, and and so I started to fool around with the quatrains, and then I realized I could create this kind of rhythm, which I think you're pointing to, between the prose and the quatrains, and then once I had that, the way all this works is you're sort of channeling or whatever the hell's going on in your head, and so you get into this place where you just start writing these quatrains, and that's where I was. So yeah. Mhm.
It's interesting, and they build as you read the book. I think you've got more of a sort of window into Abe's mind, as it were. I think sometimes more from the quatrains, but also that they work together. Did you ever think of the sort of the cadence and the spacing as a song?
Yes. Yeah, very definitely. I mean, I'm very pleased to to give a shout out to Woodhall Press in terms of how this book came out on the page,
Mhm.
because that it's sort of not like any other book in a certain way,
Mhm.
in terms of the relationship between the prose and the poetry. And so it was handled very sensitively in
Mhm.
terms of the spatial part becomes really huge. You have to give the reader a pause, but if you give the reader too much of a pause, then the reader's going to lose the thread. So I was very pleased, as I say, with how it came out, because the whole book, so to speak, is a song. A couple poets have joked with me that the whole book is a poem, basically,
Mhm.
um, and in a sense, it is. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost as if we had a poster that we didn't know how to frame, where okay, we know how to cut the frames to size, but this still doesn't fit. So it took some tweaking, and even with our, the layout artist who helped, it was not obvious to them. So it was. I'm glad that you're pleased with how it came out, because we loved it. But again, it was like looking at something different. Oh, this sort of looks like a book. This looks like a poem, but I'm not quite sure what it is, which was part of the appeal to me. So one of the things with Abe, again, sort of back to Dylan, it's been said about Bob Dylan that you shouldn't believe a word that comes out of his mouth unless he's singing it. And I think Abe is much more straightforward. He's raw, but I think he's giving us an actual story, or what seems like his story. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, in a sense, I wrote the book to allow my notion of Bob to talk.
Mhm.
Because as we know from various interviews, particularly when he was younger, he basically created something like Bob Talk, which was a way of keeping the world at bay in terms of the, how to say, stupidity that could eat an artist alive many times over. So he got a grip on that pretty early. And you know, it's a funny thing about artists. They aren't they aren't necessarily the best commentators on their work,
Mhm.
because they're making the work, and so there are all kinds of, I don't know how to say, funny angles, so to speak, that they're using, indulging. Whereas I just wanted to try to be, as you said, a little more straight ahead about about this character in terms of circumstances,
Mhm.
influences, and obviously it's a work of fiction, so I could make up what I wanted to make up. Because again, the issue is an imagination,
Mhm.
in terms of where an imagination might come from, and in that sense, there was no need for my character to be oblique in the way that Dylan has often been oblique for, as I say, for to me pretty understandable reasons why he's done that.
No, absolutely, especially with, I think, to me, and one of the things that's fascinating about Dylan is that he has many misses, not just live performance, but is unafraid of trying things. Not all of them worked as well in others, but there's one musician described him as, somebody said, "What's Dylan like?" And they're reported to have said, "Oh, Bob Dylan is so many different people." So I don't think he necessarily owes anyone an answer, but wouldn't it be fascinating to actually know what was going on? I think, what is it? I think he said Blood on the Tracks, for example, was inspired by a Chekhov short story, which seems a little bit of a strain, but there you go. He has an answer and it's done, and then he doesn't have to get into it. He's actually letting the music play. Um, Other musicians that you've written about, you had an essay collection called Legends of the Slow Explosion, and you took on Miles Davis and George Harrison and Anita O'Day. And I've also, I'm not sure where it was published, but I think I saw you read about the DC-5, about the Dave Clark Five. And songs, to me, somehow seems like that kind of biographical sketch. It seems like a logical next step, except it's a complete fiction. Did you think about attacking, the subject of Dylan in an essay, or were any of those in your mind when you worked on the novel?
Well, they were in my mind. I think when I was working on the essay collection, all the people in the essay collection have passed.
Mhm.
So that would eliminate Bob.
Mhm.
Also, there's just, as I say, so much written about him.
Mhm.
As I say, and I've read a couple, well, one book I liked a lot.
Mhm.
Um, but I didn't want to go that route. I think though what you're getting at, which I think is huge, that certainly people have written about coming at it from different angles, and that's how for many of us we live through music. Um, I don't think that's an exaggeration. Um, it's been like that for me my whole life.
Mhm.
Um, Obviously, because music is nonverbal, it's notoriously hard to write about. Notoriously hard, and yet there is that fact of I could still remember when I was young, and particularly John Wesley Harding came out, and it just sort of kept me alive in a certain way. It mirrored a lot of what was going on in my life. And I think many, many, many people can point to all kinds of music
Mhm.
and make statements like that in periods in lifetimes and that so that I think that's the deep impulse. It's also, again, I construed the book as a homage
Mhm.
to a great artist. Um,
Mhm.
and whether he ever sees it or not is irrelevant. Because I wanted to make that homage. I'm very big on acknowledging or trying to acknowledge the stature of
Mhm.
artists and what they give to us, what they put into our lives. So that all is kind of background, Chris, for your question.
Yeah, no, that's interesting because, I was an amateur musician, and actually came to some of Dylan's songs before I knew they were by Dylan. All Along the Watchtower, I thought was a Jimi Hendrix tune when I was 12. I knew how to play it and I didn't know it was a Dylan tune. But just the music, even in 2020, I've been listening to more Dylan, not just because of the book coming out and working on this. And I've seen Dylan a few times. I've seen him on wonderful nights and terrible nights. But just as a sort of sense of escape or relief, how interesting or how much impact do you think, Rough and Rowdy Ways coming out this year had? I mean, that seemed to come out of left field, and also, the song Murder Most Foul. Um, I It seemed that it was meaningful to, countless people to have something new in the middle of the pandemic.
Sure. Well, it shows a couple of things. One, he's still at it,
Mhm.
which is obviously no small thing. Over decades, particularly in terms of it's so easy to just repeat yourself
Mhm.
as as an artist. Then there's a whole other dimension of his art, which at times he's acknowledged and at times he's pushed away. But that's that he's sort of been testifying all the way through um, about what's happening in the world around him. Obviously, sometimes it's been very one to one when he started out and was writing all these songs that people called protest songs, which I
Mhm.
call actually justice songs.
Mhm.
But here he is, much older, and writing about the Kennedy assassination, and basically wrestling with testifying to basically evil. And what do we do with evil, which is obviously a question we're not going to resolve tomorrow.
Mhm.
So I think that's, I mean, because again it's clear that part of his makeup is a moral conscience.
Mhm.
And again, he's pushed that away at times because obviously he doesn't want to be Mr. Moral Conscience for America and be a representative in that way. And he's an artist, so it doesn't come out as moralistic. It comes out as deeply felt in terms of whatever moral history we're talking about. I mean, Blind Willie McTell is certainly a chapter of moral history in terms of this country.
Sure, or even things, The Lonesome Death of Hattie Carroll.
Yeah.
That comes to mind, which, the title doesn't exactly roll off the tongue, and yet it's such a profound song. And as far as, back to Dylan songs, what amazes me is that you can get something that's so focused and sort of minimalist, like All Along the Watchtower. And then you have 16 and a half minutes for Murder Most Foul, or even things like Ballad of a Thin Man, or other things, the same person writing this very, very tight, focused songs, then has, stuck inside of Mobile with the Memphis Blues again, which, as my wife says, are you playing this song again, or is it still going? It just hasn't ended yet. And to me, that's part of the appeal, is that he can be adept. It's not that he moves effortlessly through these things, but he's capable of producing that.
Yeah.
What would be what do you find yourself listening to of Dylan? Do you still listen to frequently, or what are standouts? What comes to mind
in terms of Dylan?
Yeah.
Well, actually, I've just been listening to the first 3 bootlegs, volumes 1 through 3,
Mhm.
which, actually we had a long time ago on cassette. Remember
Okay.
cassettes?
Yes.
And then, I don't know, we didn't have a cassette player anymore, so I must have given it away. And then I was just thinking, I'm missing something. And then I realized that we didn't have that around the house.
Mhm.
So I've gone back to that. In fact, I was just listening to the third CD of that last night, which has that. Speaking of spare, it has that incredibly spare version of Willie McTell, just with the piano, which is just as haunting as anything you'll ever hear in this world. So that's what I've been listening to lately. But I want to say, Chris, you put your finger on something I think pretty important about him as an artist, and that's these two sides, which since I look at things often through the poetry lens, it's sort of the Whitman side and the Dickinson side. The Whitman side is the outward expatiating, cataloging, pulling together large amounts of material, going on, as you put it, the way Walt can go on. And then at the same time, there's this incredibly aesthetic that can be very spare, that clearly comes from places like the ballad stanza and the blues triplet,
Mhm.
and is remarkable in terms of not using many words to convey an enormous amount of feeling. I mean, some of those songs, like All Along the Watchtower, it's hard to believe someone actually wrote that song. It sounds so much like a folk song from 500 years ago or something.
Mhm.
And so he combines both those, to my mind, both those aesthetics in one person. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think, and it speaks to his songwriting and the poetry, the fact that so many other people have covered his songs successfully is a testament to the songs and the writing, and that there's something that people can find in them. Even cheesy ones like Manfred Mann's Quinn, the Mighty Quinn, which is elevator music, it almost predates the elevator, right? But still that different people could find things. And even now, there was an album came out, young Irish singer put out an album called Blonde on the Tracks. covering songs from Blonde on Blonde and Blood on the Tracks, that why a 27-year-old can identify with these songs is interesting. Or Chrissie Hynde from the Pretenders during quarantine, her tour was canceled, so she and her guitar player started covering Dylan tunes, including some of the newer ones. So those are so interesting. And back to the novel, I did think of one point of Whitman just going on forever, and Dickinson, and I know you sometimes teach them together, Walt and Emily. So were either of those things in your mind when you were creating this, or did it just come out organically with longer verses?
Yeah, it came out organically.
Okay.
Certainly Dickinson with the quatrains was in my
Yeah.
mind.
Mhm. So in the novel, one of the things, and from Dylan too, roads are sort of early on play an important part with Abe, and he says of town at one point the only thing to do there is to leave, I believe. But what do you have a copy of the book with you, Ian?
I do.
Would you be kind enough to read the second paragraph on page 13, which is about roads, and it's a section that sort of stuck with me from the first time I was looking at the manuscript to even now when I think about it.
Do you want the roads taught you, that paragraph?
Yep.
Okay, I'll read it. The roads taught you about death, how it seemed like every 6 months or so, someone, usually a high school kid, would lose control and crash. The roads made you want to go fast, not out of impatience. Nothing of importance was happening, but out of a longing to make something happen, anything. Going fast was a way to fulfill the longing of being wild in a predictable world, of exploding the map. Yet the longing was more than that. There was the getting into a car and not coming back. You might say you were coming back, but then you didn't. The cheerful "see you later" would echo for decades. Death was somewhere you could drive.
Thank you. So I think that's just a sort of fascinating passage, and again back with Abe's sort of the roots of America, and the post World War II with roads opening up and changing our landscape, and even now when we're restricted, not being able to drive places seems to be the thing that terrifies people, not having food. So was there anything in particular that made you focus on the roads, or anything back to Dylan? Or was it just something, from your memory? I'm just curious about that.
Well, certainly, I am, mimicking where he grew up in terms of the upper Midwest.
Mhm.
And if you've been in the upper Midwest, particularly the small towns strung out across the upper Midwest, the roads are almost the most salient feature of the whole landscape.
Mhm.
Obviously, there's beautiful plains and mountains, but as far as people are concerned, the great connector are those roads. I mean, you think about when they homesteaded and the isolation that those people endured. It was pretty extreme in many cases. And it's also just obviously part of the on the road mythology that that Dylan grew up with. I mean, this is, for better or worse, a nation of very restless people who always are thinking of, well, I could go here, or I could go there. And also, I wanted to write about someone who at a pretty early age had a strong sense, I'm not staying here. I can't do this. So So what speaks to that person are the roads, because the roads are going to take you away, even though you have no idea really. Um, I mean, you know, you see James Dean in the
Sure.
Times Square in the photo, but that's a long way from you know, from a small town in upper Minnesota. Um, but there the roads are. So, and that's why I made my character. His dad runs a trucking company because I wanted to reinforce that sense of distance and roads, trucks, cars.
Yeah. No, and it's, you know, it's important to it. Another one of the lines was, "A road was a road, the prose of American progress," right? That at least if you took the road, something could happen along the way. And I think that's fascinating. One of the other things, so Emily pops up, Emily Dickinson, on page 123. Emily D came by to shoot the usual poetic breeze. Infinity gives me hives, eternity makes me sneeze. That one must have been fun, or it's one that I enjoy. And again, it's in the idea of, you know, it's tied to the chapter about songs when he's talking about Tin Pan Alley and great American songwriting. Um, Along with the poetry and the poets, you name check a number of American musicians that certainly impacted Dylan, but sort of all of music. Um, how many of those were from you or your childhood? What did you? I'm curious where that came from. If you put that in because of Dylan or because it was also part of your background.
Both,
Both. Okay.
both. I grew up collecting things like the Smithsonian recordings
Mhm.
um, of American music. So a lot of that stuff that I know he listened to, that basically formed the kind of soil, so to speak, in part of his work. That was natural. A lot of the blues, I knew that music growing up, the country stuff. So that was all how to say, not a stretch in terms of being on the same page, which, you know, a number of people were on that page. Because Dylan, though you know, it's hard to see it at this point in time because it was a while ago. He rode in on the wave of something called folk music,
Mhm.
and all that went into folk music. Yeah,
Right. Sure. Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. Was it the Alan Lomax recordings and
right.
all of those things. And I think Pete Seeger worked for the archive, and that was, you know, going to town, recording people and sort of getting these snippets of these traditions that you know, it's interesting. I've listened to some of them, not as many, but it's just fascinating that somebody had this idea that we need to capture this before everything becomes homogenized. You know, it's no longer the local song when it's, you know, up on iTunes and everybody has access to the same version. Um, so at one point I was, you know, what still, I was thinking of questions, and one of the things I'm still surprised by Dylan once in a while. He has a massive catalog. I haven't listened to everything, but once in a while you will come across things that again surprised me, like just listen, you know, Talking World War II Blues, where he has a line about, "I'll let you be in my dream if you let me be in yours." And it sounds wonderful, and it seems to be straight out of Alice in Wonderland. And it's, you know, part of the, you know, the early sort of talking over folk tradition. And he says, "I said that," and it seems like he's got so much glee and joy performing it. It's from a YouTube performance from the early '60s. Um, to me, that's where the sort of what's exciting, that sort of the joy in the creation that he has with some of the songs, or seeing it. Do you still feel that with writing things like this? I know writings, can be brutal and difficult, but did you have any of those moments of kind of abject glee, or not abject, but unmitigated glee in writing? Abject glee is probably correct, but
That's a great phrase. I like that. Abject joy. Yeah, I was delighted that I was able to do this basically, to kind of go in. It's like going into a space when you do something like this, and so it's inspiring and exciting to go into the space, because the space didn't exist before you went into the space.
Mhm.
I've experienced this with poems hundreds of times. Obviously, with a book like this, it's a little different experience because it's much bigger, but it's the same idea basically. And there is something in it that makes you a little giddy, so to speak, in terms of the excitement of it, because you truly don't know where you're going. And I like not knowing where I'm going. And I like finding out what happens, so to speak. So yeah, so it's not, it's not like I'm sitting at my computer, yelling or cheering or anything like that. But it's a good feeling. Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. And with that, I think we will wrap it up. I've enjoyed getting to chat with you about songs. Again, Songs from a Voice. It's available everywhere. You can follow Baron Wormser on Instagram at Baron Wormser if you want to see some of the poems in the wild outside of their natural habitat. You can go to baronwormser.com for more information on this and his many other books, or visit us at woodhallpress.com. Final thing before we go, what are you writing now?
Well, I still write poems. So I'm actually writing on, sort of working on the last couple of days, a very formal poem using rhyme and meter that has a sort of Elizabethan feel to it. And I'm working on a long novel. I'm on the fourth draft of a novel, 360 pages at the moment, dealing with a family during the first half of 1968, which means it covers the time of Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination and the assassination of Robert Kennedy, the heightening of the war in Vietnam. Very, very intense time in American history. Actually, the present moment is the only time I think I've lived through analogous to that time.
Mhm.
So it's kind of, how to say, a little eerie to be living through 2020 and then also be writing about 1968. That's what I'm doing.
They must seem eerily familiar to one another in ways that you would hope they wouldn't be.
Exactly.
Good. All right, that's it for this afternoon. Baron Wormser, thank you very much, and happy writing.
Very welcome. Take care, Chris.
All right.